On July 31st, 1992, a Thai Airways Airbus A310 carrying 113 passengers and crew mysteriously vanished over the Himalayan mountains in Nepal. There had been no distress signal from the pilots. Days later, the wreckage was discovered miles from anywhere the plane should have been flying. How had the crew of this flight ended up so far off course? When investigators analysed the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, they were baffled. Kathmandu had no radar, but this alone did not cause the accident. It was monsoon season in Nepal, but this alone did not cause the accident. There was a mechanical issue with the aircraft, but this did not cause the accident either. The primary cause of this accident was something which could strike any aircraft at any time, anywhere in the world. For years, Flight 311 would serve as a case study for airline pilots worldwide, and as a cautionary tale for anyone flying into mountainous areas. This is the story of Thai Airways Flight 311. July 31st, 1992, 10:30 in the morning. Thai Airways Flight 311 lifted off from the runway at Bangkok's Don Muang International Airport in Thailand and headed northwest for the 3-hour journey to Kathmandu in Nepal. On board were 99 passengers and 14 crew. The passengers were a mixture of Nepalese people returning home, Thai nationals, and tourists from 12 countries around the world, including the United States, Japan, Belgium, Germany, and Finland, among others. Many of these passengers had booked this trip so that they could experience the breathtaking Himalayan mountains firsthand. In the cockpit were 2 pilots, Captain Prida Sutimai, 41 years old, and First Officer Phunphat Bunyaye, 52 years old. Both were experienced pilots, however, there was a stark difference in the authority which each of them could command on the flight deck. The captain had been earmarked by many at Thai Airways as someone who would rise to the top ranks of the company very quickly, while the first officer had been marked early on as, quote, not captain material. It was understood that he would remain a first officer for the rest of his career. This power differential would go on to play a decisive role in the events on this day. The aircraft being used for this flight was a 4-year-old Airbus A310. The A310 was a modern passenger jet in 1992 with a spotless safety record. It served the medium to long-haul market, and nowadays its equivalent is the Airbus A330. At the time of this flight, the A310 was 9 years into passenger service and had never been involved in a fatal accident. Thai Airways had 4 of these aircraft. By the end of the decade, they will have lost 2 of them to fatal crashes. The cockpit had all the bells and whistles of a modern airliner at the time, including large electronic displays and advanced autopilot and navigation systems. However, as we will see, this automation alone is no guarantee of safety. In fact, on this day, the very complexity of this automation would actually work against the pilots. The aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude, and for the first 2.5 hours, the flight progressed as normal. At 12:30 in the afternoon, as the flight neared Kathmandu, the pilots tried to make contact with air traffic control. Initially, they were met with no response. This was not unusual at Kathmandu, however. The city is situated in the foothills of the tallest and most extensive mountain range in the world, the Himalayas. The airport lies between 2 mountain ranges, which border it to the north and to the south. South of the airport, the mountains reach altitudes of up to 9,000 feet, whereas to the north, they extend as high as 26,000 feet. For this reason, large aircraft always approach the airport from the south, where the mountains are lower. In mountainous regions, radio communication can be patchy, and the pilots of Flight 311 were no strangers to this feature of mountain flying. The location of Kathmandu's airport also posed some other unique challenges to pilots flying into it. The prevailing wind in the area meant that when the runway was first laid down in 1949, it was built from north to south. This created a challenge for pilots flying into the airport, especially those flying larger aircraft. It meant that once they had passed over the mountains, they had to descend steeply to make it to the airport. To add to all of this, Flight 311 was arriving during the peak of monsoon season. The entire region was shrouded in heavy rain and dense clouds. With nothing but whiteness out the windscreen, the pilots would have to navigate using only their instruments. And finally, to top it all off, Kathmandu's Tribhuvan airport did not have radar. Controllers had to rely on position reports from pilots to build a mental picture of where the aircraft in their airspace were. At around 12:30 in the afternoon, the pilots finally got through to Kathmandu air traffic control. The controller cleared them for an instrument approach known as the Sierra VOR circling approach, which would have them landing from the north on runway 20. However, the captain was not happy with this clearance. He did not want to bring his aircraft in from the north, because given the poor visibility, it would not be safe to circle to land at runway 20 using only instruments, considering how close this would bring the aircraft to the surrounding terrain. He asked the first officer to calculate the fuel required to fly to their alternate airport of Calcutta, in India. This was over 600 kilometers away, and would be a significant diversion for the passengers. However, moments later, the controller notified the crew of a change in wind direction and cleared them for a straight-in approach to runway 02. They were to fly the so-called Sierra approach, which would involve them flying first to a waypoint called Romeo, about 75 kilometers south of the airport, and then straight towards the runway, descending steeply after passing over the mountains to the south of the airport. Everything was now in place for a relatively normal landing at Kathmandu. As the crew set the aircraft up for the approach, they began lowering the flaps. Because of the steepness of this approach, the crew were required to use full flaps, as these would provide the necessary drag to stop the aircraft from getting too fast during its steep descent. However, at this point the crew encountered a problem. When they tried to lower the flaps to 15 degrees, they got stuck. Without the ability to use flaps, there was no way that the crew would be able to land at Kathmandu. They called the controller asking for a diversion to Calcutta. However, before the controller could give this clearance, the crew managed to get the flaps working again, by simply retracting them and then extending them. They informed the controller that they had fixed the issue, and that they wanted to continue the approach into Kathmandu. The aircraft was now about 20 kilometers from the airport, however, and it was too high above the ideal approach path. It would not be safe to descend for a landing from here, so the crew asked air traffic control if they could turn back to the Romeo waypoint behind them, and then try the approach again from there. Investigators would later notice something strange about the flight at this point. It appeared that the captain was making all of the radio transmissions, as well as flying the aircraft. This is a stark departure from how workload is supposed to be managed on commercial airliners. In aviation, there are clearly defined roles in the cockpit, where one pilot is designated pilot flying, and the other pilot not flying. The pilot not flying carries out duties like talking to air traffic control and reading the checklists, while the pilot flying, naturally, flies the aircraft. This splitting of the workload is essential for safety, especially during busy phases of flight such as approach and landing. It prevents any one flight crew member from becoming task saturated. When the captain requested a turn back to begin the approach again, he received no response from air traffic control. In fact, he called 4 times, and each time received no response. The aircraft was getting ever closer to the airport, and was now barely 10 kilometers away. At this point, still with no answer from the controller, the captain decided to take matters into his own hands. He started to turn back towards the Romeo waypoint behind him. He chose a right-hand turn instead of a left-hand turn, because the controller had previously advised them that there were other aircraft off to their left-hand side. To turn the aircraft, the captain used the heading select mode of the autopilot. He instructed the first officer to locate the Romeo waypoint using the flight management computer. As the first officer tried to locate Romeo, the captain started to climb from his current altitude of 10,500 feet to 18,000 feet, and continued twisting the heading select knob so that the aircraft continued its right-hand turn. He reported his actions to the controller, who told him to descend back to 11,500 feet because there were other aircraft at higher altitudes nearby. The captain acknowledged this instruction and dialed this descent into the autopilot. There was a lot going on in the cockpit at this point. The crew were setting up their aircraft for another approach. They were trying to locate a waypoint for that approach using the flight management computer. They were turning and climbing and then descending, and on top of all of this, they were also talking to air traffic control. The human mind can only deal with a small number of tasks at the same time. In this case, the captain had allowed himself to become overwhelmed, or, in aviation safety speak, task saturated. There were simply too many things to do in the time available. That's why, as all of this was going on, the captain continued to turn the heading select knob to the right. Without realizing it, and with no visual reference out the windscreen to track his position, he had brought the aircraft all the way back around to a northerly heading. Instead of doing a 180-degree turn onto a heading of 220, he had done a full 360 onto a heading of 022. And with both his attention and that of the first officer being fully focused on getting Romeo to show up on the flight management computer, neither pilot realized that they had done a complete circle, and were now flying straight towards some of the highest mountains in the world. When the first officer finally managed to key in the Romeo waypoint, the flight management computer displayed a 180-degree turn on the navigation display. This made no sense to the pilots. In their heads, they were heading south, and Romeo was ahead of them. Why was the flight management computer telling them that Romeo was behind them? For 6 full minutes, both pilots were preoccupied with troubleshooting the flight management system. 6 minutes is a long time in a jet aircraft. In this time, the aircraft, travelling at over 500 kilometers an hour, had covered a distance of over 50 kilometers, and this was 50 kilometers in the wrong direction, straight towards the mountains. As the pilots tried to understand what was happening, the controller got in touch, asking what their distance was from Kathmandu. The crew said that they were 5 miles from the airport. This made little sense to the controller. As far as he was aware, the crew had turned back towards Romeo minutes ago. How could they be just 5 miles from Kathmandu? Meanwhile, the pilots had been so busy trying to set up their navigation equipment that they had lost all situational awareness. It didn't strike them as odd that they were just 5 miles from the airport, even though they should easily have been at least 20 miles from it at this point. When the controller asked them to confirm that they were really 5 miles away, the captain impatiently said that this was the case. The controller, perhaps due to the fact that he was relatively inexperienced, decided not to pursue the issue further. The captain had now managed to cow both his first officer and the air traffic controller into silence. In doing so, he had cut himself off from 2 useful sources of information, both of which were now his only chances of understanding the reality of his situation. A few minutes later, the first officer finally caught on to what was happening. He noticed that the navigation display compass showed the aircraft to be heading north. He said, "We're heading north, huh?" Yet the captain, convinced of his first officer's incompetence, did not absorb the import of this question. He thought the first officer was asking when they would turn back north, so he simply replied, "We'll turn back soon." The first officer never followed this up, even though it was becoming clear that the captain had become disorientated. In fact, the whole reason that the first officer even posed this as a question, "We're heading north, huh?" was that he had been intimidated by the captain throughout the flight. With a different captain, he might have phrased this as a statement rather than as a question. He had, after all, recognized that the plane was indeed heading north, yet he was afraid that a statement to this effect would prove too affronting for a captain of this temperament. Shortly after this, the ground proximity warning system sounded an alarm in the cockpit. It was detecting the rapidly rising terrain underneath the aircraft. The first officer asked the captain to turn around, but not forcefully enough. The captain was convinced that it was a false alarm, as he knew that the mountains to the south of the airport did not reach his aircraft's altitude of 11,500 feet. Just 16 seconds after the alarm first sounded, the aircraft slammed headlong into a vertical cliff face, 11,500 feet up the side of a mountain. All 113 people on board were killed instantly. The impact was heard by local villagers, but because they were located in such a remote area, they could not get the word out to any authorities. For days, searchers looked for the aircraft in the mountains to the south of the airport, as this is where both the pilots and the air traffic controller thought that the aircraft was. Finally, several days after the crash, the local villagers managed to get in contact with the authorities and alert them to the wreckage they had found on the mountainside. It was instantly clear that there could have been no survivors. When investigators recovered and analysed the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, they discovered a shocking picture of confusion in the cockpit in the flight's final minutes. If you've seen my previous video on the crash of American Airlines Flight 965, which occurred just 3 years after this incident, the loss of situational awareness here may ring a bell. In fact, the crew of Flight 965 had actually been given this flight as a case study on how not to operate an aircraft. Investigators cited this loss of situational awareness as the primary contributor to the crash of Flight 311. Contributing to this was a peculiar feature of the A310's navigation display. Investigators noted that its compass contained only numbers, and had no letters marking out the cardinal directions of north, south, east, and west. Had these been present on the display, the pilots may have noticed earlier that they were heading north rather than south. The final report also went on to assign a role in the accident to the lack of sufficient simulator training by Thai Airways for the complex and high-terrain Kathmandu approach. It concluded that more thorough training for this approach would have imbued the pilots with a greater appreciation for the need to maintain situational awareness at all stages of the approach, and the necessity of effective crew resource management in achieving this. It also recommended that radar be installed at Kathmandu's airport, as this too would likely have prevented the accident. The most far-reaching implications of this accident went much further than Nepal, however. Above all, the captain's domineering attitude in the cockpit represented a serious breakdown in crew resource management. He had decided early on that the first officer was incompetent, and as a result of this, he took upon himself a workload that was not sustainable, and that, in fact, caused him to commit a fatal error when he brought the aircraft on a 360-degree turn back towards the high terrain to the north of the airport. This attitude also led him to misinterpret the first officer's comment that the aircraft was heading north rather than south, and moreover, to ignore both the first officer and the ground proximity warning system when it indicated that the aircraft was on a collision course with high terrain. This accident would never have happened had the captain simply shared his workload with the first officer and taken his concerns seriously during the flight. The crash of Thai Airways 311 became a case study taught to airline pilots around the world, which highlighted the importance of good crew resource management and maintaining situational awareness, especially in mountainous areas. As a result of this incident, and of a shockingly similar one which occurred just weeks after it, Tribhuvan is now a much safer airport to fly into. Improvements in crew resource management training and technological advances in terrain avoidance avionics have also made these kinds of accidents far less prevalent in commercial aviation today, even compared to the 1990s.